The premise of today's webinar is to discuss what Staff Domain deems to be a critical piece of new research. We work day in and day out with small to medium-sized accounting firms who have just beginning their offshoring journey. For those who have not offshore before, they rely heavily on an offshoring provider to educate them on the whole sector. Naturally, that results in a skewed impression of the overall experience, sometimes positive and sometimes negative. Without research, this also means that a lot of businesses go through the pain and expense of trial and error, which interestingly enough is a theme in many of the research interviews. We went to Dr. Tim Hasso and Professor Keith Duncan because they're leaders in their field and authors of a previous piece of research into offshoring of auditing services for the CPA. We asked them to independently conduct the research into the SME firms and to get their experiences with offshoring so that we could see from their perspective what is critical and what is not. We are here today to discuss those insights and experiences with you. So we'll start with the research findings and cover off with what the future holds. And then we'll share 10 critical success factors on offshoring in very practical terms. On that note, Dr. Tim, over to you to introduce the research.
Thanks, Justin. So when we first started this research, we basically just wanted to find out how common offshoring is among small to medium-sized accounting firms. Because historically speaking, it's primarily been the large players that have been offshoring to a great extent. We also wanted to figure out whether we could determine what separates those who are successful and those who have bad experiences with offshoring, with in mind of being able to create something like a blueprint for success. Now, in our research, we used a two-staged approach where we surveyed a large number of accounting firms and then conducted a number of in-depth interviews to get greater detail around the topic. Now, myself and Keith, we were quite frankly overwhelmed with the response as we had more than 1,200 people participate in the survey, which indicates that this is a topic that sparks a lot of interest. And I know that many of you in the audience today participated, so we'd like to thank you for that. Now, the high rate of interest is partially driven by the fact that offshoring is becoming much more popular these days with accounting firms. Partially as well because it's still controversial in that a lot of firms who do not offshore have quite negative opinions on the matter. Now, before we start, I would like to get some audience engagement, and I would like to have a quick poll to see how many in the audience work at a firm that is offshoring and how many work at a firm that does not. Now, while I'm waiting for everybody to answer the poll, I should probably note that one interesting thing that we did find is that both firms who offshore and those who do not generally agree on one key factor, and that is that the client relationship is the most important aspect of their competitive advantage. And I'll touch upon this again in a few minutes. Now, we can probably close the poll and see what we find. So we do find that in the audience, about a third are currently offshoring and about 70% or so are currently not offshoring and thus interested in the topic. Now, in terms of the top line results, what we found is that a quarter of all small to medium-sized accounting firms are currently using offshoring, and they're generally quite satisfied with the quality of work being done. They're satisfied to such an extent that they're ready to commit to increase of the proportion of work that they're offshoring. So currently about 27% of all hours are being offshored, and about 50-ish% plan on offshoring even more within the next 2 years. And they plan to do so to the tune of about half of their total work hours. Now, when we instead kind of focus on the next issue, which is regards to the markets that we're offshore, which is kind of covered on the next slide, we started by looking at which countries do the firms offshore to. And we did notice that there's two dominant markets, and these two dominant markets are the Philippines and India. Now, there are other markets as well, but these are really negligible in comparison to the dominance of these two centers. Now, the interesting thing about these two centers is that we did find some systematic differences between these two countries, specifically when it came to how happy the accounting firms were with their experiences. And quite a few of our firms, specifically the ones that we interviewed, and the ones that we interviewed tended to be the ones that were, I guess, highly experienced in this endeavor. They had actually tested multiple markets, both Philippines, India, some of them even had tried Vietnam and so on. So they were able to provide us with some really nice insights about the key differences between these two countries and their experiences. Now, while firms are generally happy with the work quality from any country that they offshore to, some of the finer details reveal that the experience when offshoring to Philippines seems to be a bit more smooth. So some of the things that we heard in our interviews was, for example, around the time zone difference. So Philippines is on the same time zone as Perth. So in that sense, it's not really that different from having another office in Western Australia. The second important aspect is really around culture. Now, you do see some stats in front of you, and one of the key aspects there is really that the cultural fit between Australia and Philippines is closer. In addition to that, you also have better English skills, which both kind of combine and create a much better environment for teamwork and communication, which is again important not only to get the initial result of the work quality, but really important when it comes to retention of offshore staff down the line. Now, I know that many of you who operate businesses in Australia, retention is a key issue that everybody's struggling with. Now, one of our successful firms did note that, surprisingly to us, that they actually thought that the loyalty of their offshore staff was even better than that of their domestic staff. And again, I should probably note that this is not something that happened by accident. They're very adamant on how they treat their offshore staff, in that they treat them just like any other employee in Australia. So again, Keith will touch upon this a bit later in terms of how to improve that interaction and integration. Now, on the next slide, we're going to look at some of the tasks that are currently being offshored. And again, it should come as no surprise for most of you who are in this business that it is the much more repetitive tasks such as bookkeeping, preparing financial reports, and tax that are being sent offshore. Now, this is primarily driven by the fact that these tasks can be broken down into a formal process that the offshore staff can follow precisely step by step. And by having a nice little step-by-step instructions, you basically ensure that the work is going to be of good quality. Now, the obvious question by those in the audience who are currently not offshoring is what happens to the jobs in Australia when all these tasks are being performed overseas? And we did find that a lot of those firms who do not offshore, and they have chosen not to do so intentionally, have very strong opinions about wanting to keep jobs in Australia. Now, what we found in our research is actually quite surprising, not only to these firms, but to us as well. We didn't necessarily see any trends of these firms, so firms that are offshoring, of having less employees in Australia. Instead, what happened is that the jobs in Australia changed in their dynamics. So instead of focusing on compliance type tasks, they now try to focus on the personal relationship with the client a lot more. And they tend to do a lot more high value advising to their clients. Now, this is particularly interesting because a lot of firms who do not offshore have chosen not to do it because they believe their competitive advantage is their personal relationship with the client. Whereas in our results, what we in fact found is that if you do offshore, you're actually able to free up some time and dedicate it to nurture that client relationship. Now, obviously, this does mean, unfortunately or not, depending on how you view this, that the job of accountants is changing in Australia. But even as accounting educators, we haven't necessarily seen any less demand for our accounting graduates. Instead, it's really about the skill change, and employers are demanding vastly different skills. And I think all of you are quite familiar with the fact that soft skills and the ability to adapt to change is very sought after these days. Now, on the next slide, we look at the satisfaction of work being produced across these tasks. And again, it's quite clear that the satisfaction levels seems to be related to how repetitive the task is. And again, those tasks that involve a lot more judgment tend to have a lower satisfaction rating. Now, again, this is in line with what we were told in the interviews, that it is more difficult to offshore complex tasks. Now, having said that, we should probably note that it is not impossible, it's just harder. So as Justin mentioned earlier, 3 years ago, Keith and I did a study for CPA Australia specifically on offshoring of audit work, which again is something that tends to involve a lot of judgment. Now, we found that even these tasks that involve a lot of judgment can be offshored successfully if you do things right. So you need to really invest in some key activities, such as making sure that you're formalizing your processes, making sure that you hire quality staff and not just go for the cheapest ones, and making sure that you train them properly. And again, after speaking to so many firms over the past few months, it's very clear that those who have had bad experiences in offshoring either had just bad luck, or more likely than not, they went for the cheapest provider and didn't necessarily train the offshore staff to their best of their extent. So they instead assumed that they will be able to do things without guidance. Now, having said that, I will pass it over to Keith, who will now talk a bit more about training offshore staff.
Okay, thanks, Tim. And again, welcome to our audience, and particularly those who participated in the survey. Well, as you know, accounting is a service industry, and it's all about how you manage that human capital and how you develop it. So it wasn't surprising that we found over 70% of the offshoring firms provide the training to their offshore partners. And that's a critical task, that handover of a task and then training around that. A large chunk of our respondents in the survey conduct that training offshore, but some bring staff onshore. That's a bit more expensive, but they invest in that process, and it obviously has some other benefits in terms of relationship development. And a third, but less popular option is secondment to overseas. A couple of the interviewees talked about potentially younger, some of the seniors who are interested maybe or have a connection in the offshoring country, or who want to see a little bit of the world, and also as a development activity for them. Secondment is actually an interesting option to build into your business model. But we know in our industry, in education, and particularly at the moment with our remote teaching options, there's lots of digital and technology tools available to help assist with training. So training doesn't have to be in person. There's even gamification systems available now. The ATO is using a gamification program, and we're working with a partner on that to help train. So it's not the old school training model of text-based training. It can be video, and we've got this webinar now, for instance. You can capture that, you can share that. So one of the key insights from some of our interviewees was to use technology to capture training and to then put that technical training and process training into a repository that's available for current staff, but also to be used for future staff. And one of the things, one of the participants actually called them their angels, training angels. And so if somebody asks a question, they can ask, did you look at the training angel? Have you had a look at that? And before you ask the question, have you tried to solve it yourself? A number of participants over the last 5, 7, 10 years have actually tried offshoring more than once, and Tim alluded to this earlier. And some of them have failed, and it's always useful to learn from other experiences, particularly if they're negative. So one of the fails is to, in early days in offshoring, is to send a box of material, client papers, whether they're scanned or physical, and dump that overseas and expect to get a result back. That model is really not going to work. And certainly you're not going to get papers back consistent with your in-house process, which is another issue in terms of setting up. And I think Justin can talk to this a little bit later, but formalizing your systems and processes is a key part to then being able to train others around those systems and processes. And a few of our interviewees noted that when they started formalizing their own processes, they realized that different staff in different offices actually had a different understanding of what the process was. And they actually highlighted some weaknesses. The other key factor that came out, and a number of participants identified this, is hire the senior staff first. So hire 1 or 2 senior staff first in the offshore office, train them in the processes, and train them how you want them to conduct the work. And then they can be part of your leadership team offshore, training future recruits, future junior staff as part of that. So in a sense, train the trainers first, and they'll provide the leadership, particularly if you've got a repository of materials, digital materials they can use as part of that training. So in a sense, this is not that different to setting up a local operation. As Tim said, you could be setting up an office in Western Australia, and you would work through those same steps, right? You'd have your senior people, you'd train them, and you can have ongoing training as part of that. This whole issue of training then leads into a related issue, which we've got on the next slide, which is how do we integrate that team? And I guess one of the messages I heard from a number of the interviewees was this mantra around, one team, different locations. So one team, different locations. And again, for a number of participants, they learnt this through failure. So early experiences over the last 5-7 years, a number of participants basically sent work out, expected to get that back, and it didn't work, or didn't work well, or didn't work as they hoped or expected. And so in their later attempts, they put a lot of emphasis on trying to integrate the team, integrate the communication, be that through visits, be that through other mechanisms. Now, we all know in this COVID-19 scenario where we're endlessly going to virtual meetings, we're using Teams, we're using Skype, Zoom, all sorts of tools. We're learning all of these tools. And the interesting thing is a lot of senior staff and a lot of diehards, I guess, who are not exactly haven't exactly embraced technology in the past, are learning that these are effective mechanisms. And in fact, in my own team, one of our comments recently is that we've actually become closer. Even though we're on the same floor and we're not that far apart in our offices, we've become closer by working at home, but having virtual meetings. So it's the frequency and the nature of the communications, I think, that become important. And we all know, you've got to be in the loop, right? How do you keep people in the loop? Well, they're in the email loop, whether that's a firm-wide email, whether that's in-house training, technical training. You can join technical training and virtually, you don't actually have to physically be there and get updates. And that can be regular, that can even be daily. One of the interviewees talked about ensuring that the practice manager touched base daily with their counterpart, or at least someone in the firm touched base daily with the counterpart. And of course, just acknowledging the other parties, right, in those communications. Personalizing communications is also very important. So, birthdays are a key one, celebrate those. Some people are embarrassed about that, but it is a touch point to acknowledge. Starting conversations, emails, how was your weekend? Everybody has a weekend. That's when we engage in our personal passions. A lot of that is about family as well. So asking questions about family. These are common touch points that can bring people a bit closer together. And particularly if you're dealing with offshore countries where there is a strong family-based culture. Certainly in my experiences working in a lot of countries around the world, this doesn't matter what the culture is, people have families and they're working hard to advance their family. So here's a common touch point. Some interviewees talked about visiting the offshore office and making sure there's planned outings and even karaoke. So offshoring wouldn't work for me because I'm not very good at the karaoke, but I have done that with our partner in Japan. We actually offshored an MBA program there. And I think there's some video of that, but it's not very good singing. But it's part of bringing the team together. And the key thing here, and it's really about, in some ways, it's about the onshore team. How do you break the them and us thinking? And it's not just the language, it's the activities, it's thinking inclusively. How do you break that? And that is a change management task for the onshore team. Some of our participants were also very concerned in a social responsibility sense that they don't want to set up a sweatshop in another country. So a key part of that, and so they've intentionally gone and visited the offices, cited the conditions, looked at the safety features, looked at the security. Some even talk about providing health cover to their employees and or even some of their families, right? Because that's part of how they see their social responsibility engaging with their offshore partners. So these are key things about getting our team performing. Then the next question on the next slide is, what are the benefits? Why do this? What do we get out of this? So if we go and look at the benefits, and here's the surprise, right? The common perception and maybe misperception by those who don't offshore, and certainly it was probably part of my perception that this is all about cost. I've heard the expression that, about a race to the bottom in terms of cost and the lowest quality denominator. And unfortunately, in every industry, there's probably some players who fit there, but that's not what the participants were telling us. The key insight is that the number one issue is a capacity constraint. Number one driver for offshoring. Yes, there's a cost benefit, and some of that cost benefit isn't quite as much as just comparing salaries, because you've also got to factor in time to do jobs and lag. So you can look at total costs and some other dimensions. But cost savings is not the primary driver. It's a benefit, but not the primary driver. Everyone was emphasizing that when I was talking to them in the interviews. It's about flexibility. It's about capacity. It's about filling vacant positions. A number of, and quite a few of the interviewees said, look, this was a last resort. And here's our experiences. We had key staff leave. We had poor quality onshore work. In some cases, one exit interview highlighted that the employee thought that they'd fake it till they made it, and they were faking ATO filings. And so that partner had to then redo all of that work. Poor work attitude. I'm sure some of you encounter that with particularly some of the younger staff. And graduates, and Tim touched on this point, but there are graduates who don't have client interface skills. We're not necessarily as an industry preparing students that can face up to clients. And these are critical skills now, particularly if you're not starting with compliance work, that you are much earlier on in a career putting someone in front of a client. And then young staff, you invest 3 or 4 years and then they just up and leave. So this was mentioned quite a few times. There's the pull of the city, there's the pull of other firms, there's a pull of, say, a mining boom, poaching your trained staff. So you're constantly in this training cycle. When people become useful, they then disappear. And that creates a frustration, and you can't grow your business on the back of that. So one of the key benefits that follows out of addressing a capacity constraint is that it frees up onshore staff and it changes the service levels that can be provided to clients. And this is one of the things that Tim touched on earlier. So when we free up that capacity, we can provide our onshore staff, and it takes some time for some of them to realize this, but they start to see this happening in the office, that they can engage in more sort of advisory services and they can add value to clients. Now, if an accountant's worth their salt and knows the business and knows that local region and businesses in that region, they can provide a lot of value add to the busy business owner who doesn't have the time and not necessarily the skills to apply to that. So that's one of the major benefits that flows from just engaging and addressing the capacity issue. Now, the flip side to benefits on the next slide, obviously there's some risks, and what are the sorts of perceived risks we surveyed on this. And an obvious one is around, again, this is a perception that client data is at risk. It's offshore, that's highly risky. Interestingly, Tim mentioned our earlier study where we looked at offshoring of audit work, and you might have thought that your assurance work is actually a more important risk than offshoring basic compliance work. But privacy and data security are clearly big issues, and the respondents that we talked to talked about, they address these with their service providers. They look at the country, the regulations in the country that they're offshoring to protect data. They looked at what the service providers were doing in terms of data security. Cloud computing to some extent helps mitigate these risks. And as one interview participant noted, that as an SME accounting firm, it's quite expensive to maintain your own server bank and to have the expertise in-house to do that in a small firm. So these are challenges anyway. So not necessarily seen as the major risk, but manageable. Another risk was around clients and the fear that clients potentially might reject offshore work. And that's probably more a fear than a reality. A lot of the interviewees talked about including, obviously, in their disclosures that they do include an offshore team. And there was a bit of a mix in responses here. Some don't make this as obvious in the sense that they to some extent try to hide it a little bit in terms of their engagement, but a lot who are engaged in this, particularly those when when you've got an offshore staff member working on a compliance task, and you want to have some communication about a receipt or whatever it happens to be, it's so much more efficient if you can have direct client to offshore staff communication. And so transparency was something that a lot of the participants talked about as key. And, probably in comparison to a few years ago, these days there are so many areas where offshoring is occurring that, in a sense, it's a non-issue, right? There are a few diehard clients. There were a couple of participants who said, some of their regionally based clients weren't as au fait and on board with this. Well, you handle those clients in-house, right? But by and large, it's considered a little bit of the norm. A number of participants also took the opportunity with the lower cost of the compliance work to actually build that into their business model and pass that on to clients. And now that they can do more cost-effective work, and let's face it, most clients don't want to pay for compliance work that they have to do for the ATO. That's not core business. It's a regulatory requirement. And I remember when I was working my dad's business, just how many of those activities you had to perform. And when you do them at night and the weekends, you definitely don't value those activities. But if you can get those activities done more cost effectively, then you're more likely to engage in the higher business service work, and that adds value to the client's business and they're more happy to pay for that. So maybe passing on some of those cost benefits actually helps build your business. So the last thing I wanted to talk to on the next slide is, what do we see for the future? What's down the track? So at the end of the interviews, I chatted to the participants and we sort of shot the breeze a little bit about the future. A couple of key things, and Tim touched on the first point here. The participants were expecting to increase their reliance on offshoring. And part of the driver for that is that the capacity constraints and the staffing issues really haven't diminished, right? Pull of mining booms and some things like that come and go, but largely those drivers are still there. So the perception is that offshoring for these firms is here to stay and probably will increase. And part of that then also flows from the second point here, is that in shifting the business models, right, them freeing up, partners and staff from, their treasured compliance work. There are always those people who love that sort of work, and allowing their jobs to be enriched, then you can add client value through the advisory service kind of work. And as Tim pointed out earlier, a lot of the participants told me about, and they put numbers on this, increases in revenue, increases in staff, and bottom line growth, which I was a little bit surprised about. I thought that the cost benefit would lead to, hey, this keeps us holding water, not necessarily a growth in the business. So that was a little bit surprising to me. And a few of the principals talked about, they're now freed up to act as outsourced CFOs. They're having fun working with some of their clients. And some of them have shifted to the more high value clients where they can do that and let go of some of their compliance work, in fact. Last point is a number of respondents talked about, and this is a concern for a lot in the profession and for us as educators, I might add. What's the role of automation and AI? Is this going to replace the compliance work, the rule-based work? Well, sure. Is that going to make the rest of us redundant? I don't think so. I think it's going to change the nature of the work. And that was what was coming out from our survey participants. For instance, one participant actually invested in producing a self-managed super fund audit program as an automated AI program, spent considerable amounts of money on this, and now they can deliver that at a similar price to offshoring self-managed super fund audits. So that was it's replaced offshore work in their case, or at least competes with it. So what do we take from this? I think we're going to see a shift in business models as we're seeing in other sectors. There's going to be a mix of offshoring, and that's an individual preference, from no offshoring to one of our interview participants, 100% offshores. There's them and everyone else, including their executive assistant, who orders their coffee from the coffee shop next door and gets it delivered. But that all happens from the Philippines, and lunch for that matter. I actually kind of like that idea of getting lunch delivered. So that would work for me. So a mix potential in the models. There'll be some automation. There's going to be automation of work, but I think that that's going to free up both onshore and offshore teams to focus on the value add work. And the value add work is the data analytics kind of work, dashboarding, visualization, advisory kind of work. This is the value add work. This is the work that we're now emphasizing in some of our degree structures as the future orientated skills of accountants. So it'll be interesting to see whether that prediction pans out, but there's certainly a lot of indicators here. So we've identified 10 critical success factors, and so I want to hand over to Justin to now talk to those factors, but also put more of a practical spin on some of those factors. So I'll hand over to you now, Justin.
Thanks so much, Keith. And it's really interesting to hear the synergy between what is in this report and what we see in real life. And we see this with not just our current clients, but people who are coming to us in the accounting industry and the problems that they're facing. A lot of the big clients we're getting now, a lot of the clients we're getting are coming in from regional areas, places where they just can't find the talent and they can't get that people to work. And so that's why they're coming to us to help fulfill their needs. So really what I'd like to talk about first is selecting the right offshoring partner, which is the first point. It's really critical that we understand what a good offshoring partner looks like, no matter where they are in the world. What is the facility like? What is the culture like? Is it somewhere that you or your staff would be happy to work? Another thing to consider is a lot of these places are actually in developing nations. What are their systems like? What are the backups like? What's the technology like? There are so many things that go into considering who is a good partner, above and beyond the people that are working there, but also the facility and the infrastructure itself. Think about the place, inspect the place. A lot of times we have clients, and I know that a lot of other BPOs have clients that come out and they'll visit the site before they decide who they would like to go with. And I think that's really important. Either that'll communicate with people or do your research and to find the right partner. The second thing is about hiring offshore staff, okay? The hiring process is a really critical part of getting this right. What is involved? You need to understand your offshore provider's recruitment cycle. How do they find talent? How do they screen talent? How do they make sure that the talent you are getting are who they say they are and they can do what they can say they can do? You need to make sure there are multiple steps in place and that you, as the client, get the final sign-off on who works for you. At the end of the day, people can look great on paper, but unless they're going to assimilate well into your team, it's not going to be a good synergy between the two. Make sure too that you understand what the costs are. A lot of offshore providers have hidden costs like extra monitor costs or extra bandwidth costs. It's important to understand what the overall all-in cost is and compare apples with apples whenever you do look for an offshoring provider and when you're looking at hiring the right staff. The third point is to hire a senior. Usually when you come at the gate, the best person to hire is your senior or your cornerstone person. This is the person that your staff member will train in Australia that will become the cornerstone or the backbone of your company out here. It's important that you may pay a little bit more for them, but it's important that you get that person out the gate so that you can show them your company's corporate culture, and so that you can understand them and you can also obviously work with them to make sure that what you want is getting done out here to the level that you expect it to be done. The fourth point is handover and training and open communication. The same as in Australia, you wouldn't hire somebody and then stick them in the corner and not speak to them. Same thing applies here. Employees are the same world around. They want to interact with other staff members. They want to get to know you. They want to get to know your team. It's really important for the first 6 weeks. It's almost critical, really, that there's a lot of communication between whoever is their main point of contact in Australia and your offshore staff members. Once they're onboarded, then you can find that they can relax a little bit, particularly with that cornerstone person in place. The general day-to-day communication will be with that person. But it's important to include them in things like meetings, reviews, and give them feedback on the information. Communication is really easy nowadays with things like Microsoft Teams, Skype, Slack, VoIP integrated phone systems, and other things like Zoom, as we're coming to you guys now. I think it's really critical to have that training and having that open communication with your internal and your staff overseas. The fifth point is to integrate your offshore staff. Even though they are working from another office, Keith and Tim both touched on this earlier, but it's important that it's one team. At the end of the day, it's one client that everyone's getting paid from. So we need to make sure that everyone feels like they're all a part of the one team. Weekly conferences are really great. Looping people in on company-wide emails, introducing your new staff members to the rest of the company is important too. Birthdays and other things, it's a part of a group celebration. After all, it's a community. It's not just them, us and them. It's that one mentality that really helps people be successful in this. The sixth point is a manager to manage the teams. Initially, I always recommend to anybody that's starting out in offshoring to have a single point of contact. That person may be a manager inside your offices, which your person here in the Philippines will directly communicate with to answer any questions, similar to a buddy system or a standard management system that we have in Australia. The same way that if you brought someone into your office in Australia, they would have someone that they'll directly report to on a day-to-day basis. That also helps you track their progress through the tasks, and it helps you overcome any challenges that they may have. Seventh point is to get your team comfortable with offshoring. Not so long ago, actually, it would be late last year, I was actually in Gosford speaking to one of my clients. It was a relatively new client at that stage. And when I went into their office to speak to them, there was a lot of pushback from their staff. They were concerned about were their jobs be under threat? What would their role look like? How would this affect their business and them on a day-to-day basis? The reality is that the offshore staff here are here to support the onshore staff in Australia. Accounting is changing. Irrespective of what we think or what we feel, the reality is that it is. We need to be out there providing higher level services to our clients, speaking with them, meeting with them, giving them, adding value to their organizations above and beyond the standardized compliance work that we would always do. It's important that the staff understand that their job is not under threat, but their job will change, as all of our jobs will change in the coming future. Having the right technology is the next point. Having the right technology is the skills. A lot of us have been forced to work externally over the past couple of weeks, or months in many cases, and we've had to adapt our businesses to that. Now, obviously, understanding how technology integrates with your offshore team is very simple when you think about how it's offshored with this particular pandemic. Things like two-factor authentication, IP locking, password management, and other things like that are something that we all need to take into consideration, particularly now with cloud computing, the power of that. With the right service provider, they'll walk you through how to strategize and how to make sure that your data is secure at all times. They'll also help you with integration of things like phone systems and other communication devices. Formalizing business processes. It's really interesting. A lot of clients that we have that come to us have no real formalization of their business, of their processes. A lot of the time it's smaller firms that need help with this the most. And the thing to understand is you start with the very basics. How do you like your work papers presented? How do you like your files named? How do you like your files filed? These are really simple core things that you can use then to build out on extended processes. We were talking earlier, actually, Keith was mentioning earlier about the angel files. Similar kind of thing. A lot of our clients are building out knowledge bases now. When someone completes a task for the first time, they put it in the knowledge base so that other people in the team can go and refer to it when they need to. And that is then becomes a part, not just of the offshore team's data, but of the whole company's data. And it's one data set for everyone. So that as they onboard new people in their team in Australia, that data set is there and available to them too. Last but very way not least is the staggered approach. Last year, I had a client come to me from Melbourne who had a rather substantial sized superannuation fund company down there. They wanted to hire 5 staff all at once. Never had they offshore before. And I had really big concerns about this, and I voiced my concerns to them. At that point in time, they decided to go with another service provider who said to them that there was no problem in offshoring 5 staff at once. The reality is they didn't have any processes or procedures in place. And when they did that, the whole thing actually imploded on itself very rapidly, because there was one person in Australia was the main point of contact for 5 brand new staff that were learning the whole system all at once. Rather than starting with that cornerstone person, training them and having them train the individual staff as they bring them on. That's not to say that you can't rapidly ramp up, but you should always start with one to make sure that the teething issues are done and out of the way. With that being said, they're the real 10 critical success factors that I think that have come across in Tim and Keith's research. But obviously there are more. And if you guys have any questions around that, we'd like to take a time now to actually answer them for you. So I'll turn the over to Marie. And Marie, if you have any questions you'd like us to answer, please feel free to come across now.
Thank you very much. We actually have some fantastic questions. So we'll try to get through them all, but if we don't, we will in follow-up send the questions and answers via email to all attendees. Okay, so Keith, you touched on this one briefly, but I'm wondering whether maybe Justin, you can shed some more light on the issue of security around client information. The question specifically is, how secure is our client information when their work is completed offshore?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting question, Marie. When you look at the facilities, a good offshoring facility, regardless of where they are in the world, will have certain protocols in place. Things like no phone or security policies, physical security policies, as well as IT security policies. I'll give you an example. The computers should be fully locked down. Everything should be monitored around the clock. They should only be able to access certain websites and certain information at certain times. For example, they shouldn't be able to get access to their personal email accounts or anything else like that, or live chat. Also, two-factor authentication is really critical, but you need to place it on the desktop, not on particular mobile phones. There are also things like excluding mobile phones from work areas, another big thing. The reality is that inside of most BPOs, there is really stringent technology and security factors because of those fears. And more so, I'd say in most cases, our facility in particular will be more secure than most workplaces in Australia. Most people can't even get into the facility outside of the normal operating hours. They have to actually get security to escort them in. Things like that make it a very secure site, and the data is extremely secure because most of it is done in the cloud.
Fantastic, thank you. The next question is, being at the other end of the spectrum, how do you best address the taken for granted attitudes of clients having you do extra unpaid work? I think this is about, you know, if the offshore cost of staff is lower, does that get passed on? Maybe Keith, what were your findings on that?
I had a couple of conversations about, there was one of the interviewees in particular talked about using that as a differentiator. So to pass on the cost savings, to actually engage with their clients and recognize, you know, here's this compliance work, we can do it more cost effectively. And here's our ability to then bill for value add work. So I guess it's a conversation within the client, but also within your team about how you're going to manage that. So it could definitely be a point of difference in how you engage with clients.
Great. Our next question, do the offshore providers have faster internet access to cloud files and web browser accounting apps? During COVID-19, many stay-at-home workers are struggling with poor internet speeds, which makes them less efficient. JP, I know you've had some experience with this recently in setting up people from home.
Yeah, it's very interesting, right? So there's two parts to this question. There's the staff that are currently in a work from home scenario and the facility itself. Our facility itself, for example, has 5 internet connections that are 600 megabytes per second symmetrical connections. Why do we have 5? If 4 go down, we still have 1. Okay, so we want to make sure that we have multiple failovers just in case anything bad was to happen. In relation to obviously people are working from home, well, in that particular scenario, what happens is the staff will remote into their computers inside of our facility, so the data is still secure, and all of the functions are carried out inside of the facility here. Now, the response time to the servers from our facility is the same as anywhere else in the world. It really depends on where those servers are located. Most are located though either in Australia, Hong Kong, or Singapore.
Fabulous. On the topic, just quickly going back on cost, someone's asking here, how much cost savings are we talking about? So
typically, is that one for me, Marie?
Yeah, why don't you answer that one?
Yeah, okay. typically it's about 60% savings. It's about 60% of the cost of what you pay for somebody in Australia on a like-for-like basis. Now, when I say that, when you think of somebody that's 8-year tenured accountant, a senior accountant with a degree, and obviously based on skill, tenure, and education, when you look at that, that person might cost you, for example, 100,000, we'll call it in Australia, give or take. The same person with the same skill set and the same education, with the same Australian experience, will cost you about 40,000 out here, for example.
Mm-hmm. I'm just asking this to Tim and Keith, or you two, JP. Are you guys aware of what the savings might be in other markets?
I remember a couple of the participants talked about somewhere even down to as low as around about the half kind of level in cost. There was a couple of examples. I'd have to go and look them up where they ran us through some numbers. So it depends on the marketplace, I think. Obviously, it's a range. Like anything, there's a variance. One thing that was raised as a little bit of a concern, as a local partner, I don't know what the going rates of salaries are in the offshore countries. And so that was a little bit of a concern for some of the participants, that they had to rely a little bit on their BPO to advise them, hey, here's the right salary for that set of qualifications in the offshore market. So that is an area where you do have to lean on, I think, on the BPO a little bit to help with that, or else do a lot of research yourself as part of that.
Okay. Do you consider the foreign currency risks as a factor that may be deterring Australian companies from offshoring? Justin, have you seen anything in your day-to-day dealings?
Look, currency fluctuation is also always something that's on people's minds. I think when you factor it in, the cost savings are still significant enough. In saying that, when I look at the Philippine peso against the Australian dollar over the past, let's say 24 months, it's probably varied about 6 pesos. So it's negligible. And that's mainly because the Australian dollar sometimes can be up and down, particularly with the current pandemic that's happening. In saying that, we are compared year on year to this time last year, I think we're only down about 4 pesos, even with the current economic outcries happening at the moment.
And if I could add a little bit to that, remember one of the primary drivers that has been raised by at least our interview participants is that this is about capacity. So even if we're talking the same price, some of the participants said they would still have engaged in this because they just couldn't get the staff of the quality. So yes, there will be some variation in total cost, but do remember the driver here is not about cost. It is one of the benefits, but not necessarily the primary driver.
Okay. I think this one might be for you, Tim. CPA Australia Firms of the Future report said that clients don't want offshoring. The questionnaire said that they offshore and have not found this to be the case with clients. Just want to make the point that perhaps the bodies are scared of it.
I think that's a really good and valid question, because I do think probably the preconception a lot of people have is that everybody's negative towards offshoring. And I think we've all had bad experiences when we call the call center and reach somebody who's being offshored and you can't understand them, the connection is bad and so on. And obviously that might lead to some people, having some negative experiences. But we haven't necessarily found that many of our clients have, I shouldn't say clients, but many of our participants had clients who objected to it to a great degree. Now, there will always have a few of them that will be very adamant on, I want to keep jobs in Australia, I don't want any offshoring, but that is a tiny, tiny minimal portion. So generally speaking, if you hire the right offshore staff and you can deliver quality, that's just going to kind of increase, the perception out in the marketplace. And as offshoring, has kind of developed over the past 20 years, it's basically become the norm within most businesses. So I don't necessarily see that being a big issue. And I think what the person who asked it is quite right in the sense that there may be a bit of a, I should say fear in the sense that CPA Australia in this case, or even the professional bodies, maybe trying to alleviate some of the concerns of the accountants. But again, as we found in this, I guess, research, we haven't actually found that the number of jobs has decreased. It's just that the type of work has changed. And I think this is a much stronger message that's not fear-based, but more about that we need to kind of rise up to the challenge and do more value-added work.
And I think you touched on that point in the beginning, Tim, when you talked about, you know, differentiate on service. I mean, take our education industry as a parallel to think through. There are MOOCs in the US where you could study anything. So conceivably, you don't need universities at all in Australia. You don't need any, right? You can get courses provided from offshore, but you know what? People like to talk to people. As much as we can use technology, we're doing it now. Ultimately, people like to talk to people. They like to engage locally as part of that economy. And if you're adding that service, you know, somebody can walk into your office and ring you up and get the cash flow projection done so they can go to the bank that afternoon. That's part of that service. That's part of that personal touch. And I don't think that will disappear. What I think is these things help tool up and parallel our existing industries and help that, but they won't kill them. You know, we're still going to have universities in Australia. We're still going to have accountants in every town. The nature of the work might adjust and the proportions of that might adjust.
Fantastic, thank you. And we still have a lot of questions, so I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get through all of them, but I will finish on this one. Do the offshore staff have Australian CPA or CA qualifications? Justin?
Yeah, so there is a CPA out. Well, there is a CA and CPA out here. We're more so based around the American model, in saying that when you look at accounting overall, the theory behind it is very much the same in any country, right? Obviously, the idiosyncrasies between each country's tax systems and paperwork is slightly different, but they are CA and CPA qualified accountants out here.